Good morning. I want to salute all of you, survivors of this government's war on wealth. Thank you for making it out of the trenches to come here today, now that you've survived the worst labor government this country has ever seen. I was planning a talk about geopolitics in general, and then woke up this weekend to find Russia in tumult. And the question that we in the West have to ask ourselves is, not only what does this mean for us, but what does this mean for the future of geopolitics? The very randomness of this act, the fact that in some ways it was going to happen in plain sight, but our elites never warned us, let alone Putin's elites. The anarchy of what we saw, the takeover of the southern command of Russia by Wagner forces, the fact that these people were en route to Moscow, but that brilliant politician and diplomat, Mr. Lukashenko, managed to save the day. The world owes Mr. Lukashenko a vote of thanks. And that just tells you a lot about the state of the world today. There is no question that Mr. Putin is weakened, but there is also no question that we in the West have less influence on affairs in Moscow than we've ever had before. Yes, to some extent, the sectoral sanctions may be biting, but the individual sanctions, which many of you have come up against because we in England are proud to discriminate. We are proud to discriminate against anyone with a Russian name. We have abandoned human rights in favor of going after people that we label oligarchs without any understanding of what an oligarch actually is. Because an oligarch is somebody who has political power. And most of the people we've sanctioned had some power under Yeltsin, but have very little under Putin. But it doesn't matter, because what our laws have done, and I hesitate to call them laws, because there's really nothing legal about taking a group of people who, because of their wealth, we feel we can seize their assets. Now some of our brilliant legislators say we can sell their assets, and simply rid them of their rights, rid them of their earnings and income, without any thought as to individual culpability. What are we teaching our people? That our Foreign and Commonwealth Office literally trumpets the seizure of private assets day in and day out. What is this Labor government preparing us for? And I will tell you, there is no one in the world with substantial wealth that is attracted to England today based upon our conduct with respect to Russia. And one of the things we don't understand, and the Americans are sort of puzzled about, is the global South isn't following our example. And they're not following our example because they think we're hypocrites. They think that we're all about human rights when it suits us, and that we're not about human rights when it's not in our geostrategic interests. I don't know what could make them believe that. Could it be Saudi Arabia's takeover of Gulf? I don't know. Could it be the fact that the United States, and in many ways Britain, continues to support autocratic leaders all over the world until somehow we feel they threaten the geostrategic interests of the United States? And this is a very important lesson for all of us, because the glee with which we are sanctioning people because they are Russian, this can be transferred in a day to Muslims, Jews, or any other minority. How do we post-Brexit believe that this island will attract the best and the brightest when our compliance standards are the toughest? We are engaging in this massive war on corruption and money laundering, and we are making it so difficult to transact business in this country that the easiest job in England today is to be a compliance officer at a bank, because all you have to do is say no. We are in a situation where we are developing enemies to try to justify our bloated executive control. I'm going to make a very controversial statement right now. I am going to tell you that China will not invade Taiwan. We are all being told that we have to protect ourselves. We've got to yank out the Huawei videos. We've got to do everything we can to protect us from the Chinese empire. They are going to take over the world. Really? Is that really the case? Are we really thinking through this? Isn't it true that Taiwan's biggest trading partner is China? Isn't it true that every leader of China knows his GDP has to be, not his GDP, his GDP, the growth in his economy has to hit 6%, or he loses his job and maybe his life? Why do we think they are going to crush their economy to take over Taiwan? This is a false narrative, and it is very important for us to understand this false narrative, because in so many ways, our war on corruption, our war on money laundering, are tools of a certain foreign policy and legacy of control that actually, for you and I, make very little sense. We are putting ourselves in a situation where, in reality, these meta policies, like the alienation from China and the sanctioning of Russia, a lot of it is being done for domestic consumption, or because post-Brexit, our government is so afraid of pissing off the Americans that there's literally nothing they won't do. If we thought Blair was the poodle, I don't know what Sunak is. But I can only tell you that this asymmetric relationship with the United States has to end if Brexit is to make any sense. The interesting thing is, Xi Jinping has a feedback loop. The Communist Party survives because there's a tremendous amount of feedback going on in China, which is why he did a 180 over his COVID policy. That was a very important move, and it signaled that the feedback loop in China works. And one of the dialectics of an autocracy is they can actually respond to people's wishes on a dime. We can't. Our politicians aren't. Our politicians, let's talk about the U.S. Our politics in the U.S., consumed with abortion, consumed with the polarization that involves Mr. Trump in the last election. Is that really in the interests of the people of that country? Well, the answer is no, because the elites have made a very important decision. One of the most important changes in U.S. planning has occurred with almost no understanding outside of the halls of power in Washington. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, gave a speech a few weeks ago where he changed American economic and foreign policy. It was an incredible speech. He basically said the United States has to adopt a form of central planning. The United States has to incentivize the transition we're going to undergo in respect to AI and green technologies. And the government has to lead the way. This was incredibly important because the new policies of the United States are discriminatory. They are not taking into account European industries. The Americans are not listening to either the UK or Europe. And that's a very important development. Number one, the US is going to be more guided by the policies of the central government and less pretend to be an entrepreneurial oasis. And number two, no matter how much kowtowing we intend to do, we have less and less power in Washington. And what we have done in this most recent round of sanctioning against Russia is we have taken a crucial adversary and we have reinforced to some extent their internal control by sanctioning all the oligarchs. Whether or not these people believed in Putin, whether they lived here, whatever their political beliefs, we've actually consolidated, when it comes to individual sanctions, Putin's rule. In respect to China and India, what have we done? We have given Xi Jinping the gift of life. We have provided him with Russia as a dependent satellite from which he can extract massive amounts of resources at an incredibly low price. For India, a few things have happened. One, they've discovered a hell of a lot of oil somewhere because they're now becoming one of the world's leading oil exporters. Crude from Russia is turning the Indian economy. And what has happened as well, geopolitically, is the Indians have understood very clearly that their prickly relationship with the United States doesn't make much sense anymore. Modi's recent visit was incredibly important for a number of factors. Number one, in terms of technology, there's going to be a tremendous acceleration, particularly in defense-related industries between the US and India. And number two, the United States has decided to take a blind eye to Modi's domestic policies, which are completely anti-democratic, strongly anti-Muslim, changing the status quo dramatically in terms of India geopolitically by changing the status of Kashmir unilaterally, changing the status of India's Muslims, and threatening a kinetic war with China. We are empowering Modi's policies, and we are doing it without much of a thought in terms of what the long-term impact is on the West. In terms of Latin America, we've seen a dramatic shift to the left and a dramatic takeover of Latin America by China. I don't know how many of you travel or work there, but the Chinese footprint in Latin America is actually bigger than the Chinese footprint in Africa, and yet not studied or understood. The relationship with China either has to find some way of normalization, or we will find ourselves in a totally balkanized world. We cannot fully de-risk from China. Our economies are too interwoven to allow that to happen. So we need to understand and draw a line under the hate speech we're presently seeing. And we need to go back domestically and internally to something called rule of law. We are losing it in this country in a very big way. If you're in banking, or investments, you know what it takes to go through compliance, and you know very well how much discretion is now being given to individuals over other businesses' livelihoods with absolutely no accountability. We have a war in this country on money laundering and economic crime that you read about every day that is another false narrative. Is money laundering bad? Yes. Is money laundering anything near as dangerous as we are pretending it to be? Absolutely not. And we continue to harass some of our most productive elites in this country by questioning every transfer, every move they make, and allowing everyone to be under suspicion. What I hate about sanctions is, when I went to law school, we were always told that the beauty of law is the bright line. Law teaches you what you can do and what you can't do. Sanctions and anti-money laundering and all these other concepts that we've thrown on because we're trying to download responsibility, we're trying to turn our lawyers into informers to the government, we're trying to give everybody any number of hats. What we're now doing is we're making it impossible for our professionals to know where the bright line is. I sure as hell wouldn't know where the bright line is. And I've been in business 45 years. I wouldn't know. When it comes to sanctions, it's paralyzing. People simply can't transact business because even if you're a lawyer and you get a license to represent some poor guy who's been sanctioned, your bank may not take the money anyway. There is a term that we should all look up. It's called entropy. And it talks about a process by which you start to lose control. The law or the theories that you come up with start to fall away, start to not work at all. The Treasury Department in the United States, when they were charged with weaponizing the American dollar, literally had this concept in mind, that they could paralyze the business of those countries that wouldn't toe the line of the United States. And that's actually what we're empowering them to do. Now, interestingly, the opponents of the United States are now setting up their own systems. They're setting up their own SWIFT, they're setting up their own institutions, they've set up their own Bretton Woods, if you will, in terms of major banks, and they are going to be giving us a run for the money. And my warning to all of us gathered here today is that we have to be careful about accepting the status quo of what we are being fed, both by our government and other governments. Because what the last weekend means is that nothing is as advertised. And in this world, you cannot accept assumptions, and you have to constantly be challenging those around you to seek the best results for yourself and for your community. Thank you very much.